Hello. I was recently asked to take this broken, rotten and quite frankly shameful excuse of a meter box cover and make something that was less so. It ended up looking like this, and it was generally agreed it was indeed less rotten and shameful. Someone even walked past and pointed at it, which I guess could have been in admiration or disgust, but we'll never know. So let's start with where I started, which was designing this build. And I was initially asked to recreate the box that actually existed, as everyone seemed to agree that before it became rotten and shameful, it might have actually been quite nice. Now, I've only just started my woodworking journey, but my initial impressions from studying how this was put together was that its creator was either demonstrating how not to build something, or were on a lot of drugs. I therefore decided that instead of making a like-for-like replacement, I would just start from scratch with what I'll term a sympathetic tribute, which I initially drew up on the iPad to figure out what materials and dimensions would be needed. So let's get into how I went from the initial model to actually assembling the real thing together. And the first thing I did was to add a temporary sacrificial fence to the table saw sled. And from there I could mark out each measurement, and then just add a stop block, which would allow me to make repeated cuts. I made that first cut, checked it was the length I was aiming for, and then, having surprised myself at actually doing something correctly, decided to press on and make all the remaining cuts needed for that length. Having done that, I could move the stop block to the next length I needed to cut, process that batch, and then go ahead and repeat. And I'm going to spare you watching all of that process, so we'll move on to how I made the actual joinery. I decided to go with half flaps here because I like to overcomplicate basic tasks, and I started by setting up a stop block such that the outside edge of the table saw blade would align perfectly with the thickness of a batten. Having set the stop block, I could then set the table saw blade height to half the thickness of the batten, and I could then start running the wood through. After each pass, I can shift the batten over one blade thickness at a time, and repeat that until I've removed all the material needed. After doing this to two battens, I could check how they fit together, and it turned out I hadn't actually quite set the table saw blade height to take off enough material, so they weren't sitting flush to one another. I adjusted the saw blade height accordingly, and processed them all again until they all aligned perfectly. With all the right-angled half-laps cut, I could move on to cutting the half-laps for the sloped tops. I did this by first rough assembling the unit together, or the frames that would ultimately make the unit, and then scribe align all the points where the battens would overlap. At that point I can use a different table saw sled to cut the half-laps at that angle that I've scribed. Now, as you're about to see, I forgot to properly set the blade height before making the cut, but thankfully it didn't go all the way through the material, and I could fix the height and then just plough on with removing the rest of the material on all the battens that needed it. With all the cuts eventually made, I could start rough assembling the pieces together to check they fit, and then I could put them together using exterior wood glue, applied to all surfaces that needed it, and then pinned together with just a brad nailer as a temporary clamp. If you've just seen me whack out some cling film and wonder what I'm doing here, it's because I don't have very many clamps, and I need to use them sparingly, so I'm going to clamp all three of these frames that I'm assembling together with the same 4 clamps, and the cling film just helps them stop from sticking together as that glue sets. With those clamped and drying together, I can move on to cutting the battens that are ultimately going to connect those frame sections together to make the total frame and structure of the unit, and there's also the support braces that are going to form the backing for the 2 doors. Now for these bits, I'm not going to use any fancy joinery like I don't know if a half lap counts as fancy joinery, but I'm not going to use it here. I'm honestly just going to stick it together with pocket screws, and I'm going to use the jig that I made for the French cleat wall a couple of videos ago. With all the pieces prepared for the frame now, I could turn to the cladding that's going to ultimately cover the unit. And we decided to go with tongue and groove cladding for this. Just as I did for the framing battens, I'm going to cut these pieces down to size using the crosscut sled and a stop block. With all the pieces cut, I could start fixing them to the frame itself, and I started with the side panels. I added a bit of glue to the frames, which had at this point dried, before pinning the cladding into place. Now you're going to see the cladding overhangs the frame here, and that was intentionally done so that I could come back and use the table saw sled I showed earlier to get a perfect fit in line with the frame. With that whole process complete, I could start actually assembling the frame together. I went with pocket holes again for the connecting battens before I clamped them in place and drove in the screws after having added a bit of glue and checking that everything was square. Now to clad the front of the unit and ultimately get to a point where the doors were cut where they needed to be cut, I put the panels in place and then scribed where the various overhangs and doors needed to be cut. I could then take those scribed lines over to the table saw, set the fence to match the scribed line, and then run them through. With all those cuts done, I could attach the parts that were going to be fixed to the unit in place with glue and nails before putting the unit on its front with the door cladding in place underneath it. I could then go about attaching the frames in place with glue and nails again. Now having let all that dry a little bit, we could move on to attaching the hardware. We'd gone for simple black metal hinges to match what was on the previous unit, and they were just as simple as putting them where you want them to be, pre-drilling and then screwing them in place. That's good. It does look good. Now to finish off the unit, I trimmed off the tongues and the grooves of the cladding that's going to be sat on the back and the front edges of the top of the box, before fixing them to the unit in the exact same way, just using some glue and nails. The final thing to do at this point was to put the unit into its new home. We ripped out the old cover, brushed away what must have been 30 years of spider webs, and then put the new one in place with some simple corner brackets attaching it to the brick wall. It was looking good, but it needed its hardware, which hadn't arrived by the time we put it into place. So the next day, came back and added that hardware to keep it closed, and at that point we realised that the lack of front support on the right half of the box was causing the door to hang a bit lower than the one on the left. Now it was intentional in the design to let the electrics door box that was inside open, but we agreed that it wasn't going to cause an issue to block this in, so we came back, added a support bracket to the right half, which corrected the problem. The latch needed adjusting after that to hold the door tight, and with that done, the project was all complete. I think it ended up as a big improvement on the previous cover that was in place. And there you go, there's the final box just there. If you like this video, I make lots of workshop content, and I'm slowly starting to film more projects like this as well. So feel free to subscribe, or you can leave hate comments that tell me everything I did wrong. Either works for me.